My name's Ethan. I'm 34 now, and if you met me today, you'd probably never guess where I came from. I own a small but thriving business, have a house I actually love walking into at night, and I've surrounded myself with friends who feel more like family than the people I shared DNA with ever did. But if you rewind 15 years back to when I was 19, you'd see a very different picture. That was the day my parents stood at the front door with their arms crossed, telling me flat out that I was a burden who'd never amount to anything. Those exact words have been burned into my brain ever since. I still remember the hollow sound of my own footsteps leaving that house. No suitcase, no plan, just this mix of disbelief and anger boiling in my chest. I was their son, and they tossed me out like I was some stray dog scratching at the door. Growing up in that house was never easy. My dad was the kind of man who always had to be right, the one who made a sport out of cutting people down to size. He could find fault in anything. If I got a B on a test, he'd say, "Figures. Your cousin could have gotten an A without even trying." If I got an A, he'd just shrug and say, "It won't matter. You'll mess up later anyway." My mom wasn't much better. She played the role of peacemaker, but really, that just meant she let my dad say whatever he wanted and then guilt-tripped me into silence. She'd whisper things like, "You know how your father is. Don't provoke him," as if existing in my own house was provocation enough. By the time I turned 18, I had already been walking on eggshells for years. The more I tried to earn even a sliver of their respect, the more it slipped through my fingers. They wanted me to be something specific, a carbon copy of my dad, basically. He had his hands in shady business deals, things I never fully understood back then, but I knew enough to keep my distance. When I told them I wanted to work honest jobs, even if it meant starting at the bottom, my dad sneered. 9 to 5? That's not a man's job. That's for suckers who don't know how the world works. The irony of hearing that from a man who would eventually walk into federal court in handcuffs is not lost on me now. The breaking point came not long after my 19th birthday. We'd been fighting constantly, me trying to push back, him trying to crush me into silence. That night, he said something different. He said, "You're not just a disappointment, Ethan. You're dead weight, and I won't carry you anymore." My mom was standing there, arms folded tight, her lips pressed into that thin line I came to hate. Then she looked me dead in the eye and added, "Maybe if we cut you loose, you'll learn how to swim. Or maybe you'll drown. Either way, we've done our part." And that was it. They didn't just kick me out, they washed their hands of me entirely. I slept in my car for weeks, worked odd jobs, ate cheap fast food until I was sick of it, and swore to myself every single night that one day they'd regret it. Not because I wanted revenge right then, but because I needed to believe there was something better for me than being their punching bag. What I didn't realize back then was just how deep their own mess went. My father wasn't just dabbling in shady deals. He was neck-deep in schemes that would eventually unravel in spectacular fashion. But before I get to that, I need to explain just how far they were willing to go to erase me from their lives and how, despite everything, I managed to crawl out of the hole they shoved me into. Because what happened 15 years later, when I sat in that courtroom watching my father in handcuffs, didn't come out of nowhere. It was a storm that had been brewing for years, and I was caught in the middle of it long before the world ever knew his name. That first year on my own was the hardest. I took whatever work I could find, stocking shelves at a grocery store, sweeping floors at a mechanic shop, hauling boxes in a warehouse. My dad had drilled it into me that I'd never amount to anything, and some nights, when I was too tired to even keep my eyes open, I almost believed him. But then there were moments, tiny ones, that kept me going, like the first time a manager actually said, "Good work today," or when I had enough saved to buy more than just gas station sandwiches. They were small victories, but they felt like proof that maybe I wasn't the useless burden my parents said I was. The real sting came when I'd hear about family gatherings I wasn't invited to. My cousins would post pictures online, everyone smiling around the table inside the house I grew up in. My room, I later found out, had been converted into my dad's home office, which was really just a front for whatever crooked operation he was running at the time. To them, it was like I never existed. I remember staring at one picture, my dad at the head of the table, laughing with a glass of wine in his hand, and thinking, he looks so proud, but never of me. It wasn't until a few years later that I started hearing whispers. A former neighbor mentioned to me in passing that my dad's business had taken a strange turn. Another relative hinted that he was moving money in ways that didn't make sense. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just more family drama, but deep down, I knew my father well enough to recognize that he wasn't the kind of man who played fair. And then, years later, I got the call that confirmed everything. My father had been arrested. Fraud, embezzlement, schemes so tangled it made my head spin just reading about them in the news. The man who told me I'd never amount to anything, the man who chose his shady empire over his own son, was now the one being dragged into court like a criminal. I sat there in the back of that courtroom watching him shuffle in with shackles around his wrists, and I couldn't stop the thought that echoed in my head. This is the very scheme he chose over me. But that was only the beginning, because prison has a way of humbling people, or at least making them desperate. And it didn't take long before my phone started ringing with calls from a number I never thought I'd see. My father, behind bars, begging me for help. And that's where things really started to get complicated. When I think back to my teenage years, before the night they finally kicked me out, I realized the signs were always there. My dad never really saw me as his son, more like a failed experiment he couldn't wait to scrap. But what stung the most wasn't just his constant belittling. It was the way he openly favored my younger brother, Ryan. Ryan was 2 years younger than me, and to hear my parents tell it, he was the golden child, the shining example of what a son should be. Every little thing Ryan did was put on a pedestal. When Ryan got a driver's license, my parents handed him the keys to a used car they happened to have lying around. Meanwhile, when I was learning to drive, my dad scoffed and said, "What's the point? You won't be able to afford gas anyway." At birthdays, Ryan's gifts were thoughtful, expensive things. Headphones, new clothes, the latest game console. My gifts, when they remembered, were usually a plain envelope with a $20 bill inside, like they were doing me a favor keeping it that simple. The worst part was that Ryan knew it, too, and he leaned into it. He'd smirk at me across the table whenever Dad praised him. He didn't have to say anything. The look said it all. "I'm the son they wanted, and you're not." Mom had her own way of twisting the knife. She'd tell me I was too sensitive, that I shouldn't compare myself to my brother. "We love you both the same," she'd say, but it was in that clipped tone that made it sound more like an obligation than the truth. Then she'd turn around and gush over Ryan for passing a test with a B-, while I had to practically wave my report card in front of her face just to get a nod when I brought home an A. There was one dinner that sticks out in my memory, and honestly, it was the moment I started realizing I was never going to win in that house. I was about 17 and had just gotten my first paycheck from a part-time job at the local grocery store. I was proud. I had worked hard bagging groceries until my back hurt, and I came home excited to show them that I was earning my own money. I thought maybe, just maybe, my dad would see I wasn't a burden after all. I laid the check on the table and said, "Look, I got paid today." My dad glanced at it, smirked, and said, $50? You want a medal for that?" Then he turned to Ryan, who had just been talking about how he planned to join Dad in the business someday. Dad's face lit up. "Now that's what I'm talking about. That's a son with ambition." I sat there with my untouched plate in front of me, my cheeks burning while the rest of the table laughed along with him. That check, the first proof that I could stand on my own 2 feet, became a punchline. It wasn't just favoritism, it was manipulation, too. My dad loved to pit me against Ryan, almost like it entertained him. He'd say things like, "You know, if you were more like your brother, maybe you wouldn't be such a disappointment." Or he'd call us both into the living room and test us with ridiculous questions about his line of work, praising Ryan when he parroted back what he'd overheard and rolling his eyes when I said I didn't care about that stuff. The truth was, I didn't want any part of it. Deep down, I knew my father's world was rotten, and the last thing I wanted was to get dragged into it. But the manipulation wasn't limited to competition. He also had this way of dangling approval in front of me like a carrot on a stick. One time he told me, "Ethan, if you help me out with a couple of small jobs, maybe I'll think about getting you a car." The jobs turned out to be running envelopes across town, no questions asked. I didn't know exactly what was in them, but I had a sinking feeling it wasn't something innocent. When I hesitated, he snapped, "Do you want to be a man or not?" I ended up refusing, and from that day forward, he used it as ammunition. Anytime we fought, he'd say, "You could have had a car. You could have had an easy life, but you were too weak." Mom wasn't innocent in all this, either. She had her way of making me doubt myself. Whenever I tried to stand up to Dad, she'd pull me aside later and say, "Why can't you just let things go? You know how he is." It wasn't advice. It was conditioning, teaching me that my role was to endure, to absorb, to keep the peace by sacrificing myself. And when I finally hit my breaking point, when they threw me out at 19, she didn't shed a tear. She didn't even look sad. She just stood there, arms folded, as if she'd been waiting for that day as much as Dad had. Years later, when I think about those moments, I realize how deliberate it all was. They didn't just mistreat me out of habit. It was a choice, over and over again. Every sneer, every dismissal, every time they lifted Ryan up while grinding me down. It wasn't just about who I was. It was about control. And for a long time, I let myself believe maybe they were right, that maybe I was the weak link. But I carried those memories with me after they kicked me out. They fueled me when I was working long hours, when I wanted to give up, when I questioned whether I'd ever be more than the burden they called me. And as I pieced together a life on my own, I started to realize something. Their favoritism and manipulation weren't signs that I was broken. They were signs that they were terrified I might grow into someone who didn't need them. What I didn't know back then was that Ryan, the golden child, was being groomed to take part in my father's schemes. And when those schemes started unraveling years later, my family's perfect little structure collapsed with it. But the seeds of that collapse, the cracks in the foundation were there all along in those dinners, those arguments, those cold stares. And I would soon see just how far they were willing to go when everything started falling apart. The real fracture in my relationship with my family came a couple of years before they finally kicked me out, but at the time, I didn't realize how deep it went. It was the moment I learned that betrayal wasn't just something my parents were capable of. It was something they were willing to use as a weapon against me if it suited them. I was 18, trying to keep my head down and finish high school. I had managed to save a bit from my grocery store job, tucking away a few dollars here and there with this dream that maybe I could put it toward college. I wasn't thinking Ivy League or anything fancy, just community college, something to prove to myself that I had a chance to build a life outside of my dad's shadow. It wasn't much, barely a few hundred, but to me, it was everything. That money represented hours of bagging groceries, blistered hands from hauling carts, and skipped meals so I could put a little extra aside. One evening, I came home and went to check the small envelope I kept hidden in my dresser drawer. It was gone. At first, I thought I had misplaced it, that maybe I'd moved it without remembering. But when I asked my mom if she had seen it, she froze. Her face didn't give much away, but her silence told me everything. I pressed her, and finally, she sighed and said, "Your father needed it." I couldn't believe it. Needed it. That was my savings for school. I was shaking, my chest tight, my voice cracking in a way I couldn't control. She just shrugged as if it wasn't a big deal. "Ethan, it's family money. You should be happy to contribute. Your father has bigger responsibilities than you do." When I confronted my dad later that night, he didn't even deny it. He sat there in his chair, flipping through some paperwork, and said casually, "Consider it an investment. You'll benefit when things pay off." I lost it. That was my money. I worked for that. He looked up at me with this cold, amused expression. "And I worked for this family your whole life. You think you're entitled to hoard a few bills while I keep the lights on? You should be thanking me for showing you what real responsibility looks like." I stormed out of the room, but not before Ryan chimed in, smirking from the couch. "Guess you should have hidden it better." He was laughing like it was a game. I can still hear that laugh ringing in my ears. That was the first time I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't just the theft of my savings. It was the complete disregard for my effort, my dreams, my independence. They didn't just take my money. They stole the possibility of escape I had been clinging to. For days afterward, I walked around in a haze, replaying it in my mind, wondering how a father could look his son in the eye and call theft a lesson. And it wasn't the last betrayal. A few months later, I found out my father had used my name, without my knowledge, to open a small credit line. I only discovered it when I got a letter in the mail about a missed payment. My stomach dropped as I read it, and when I showed it to my mom, she brushed it off with that same infuriating calm. "It's nothing serious. Your father's handling it." But it was serious. My name, my credit, my future. He had signed me up for debt without even telling me. And when I confronted him, he laughed in my face. "Paperwork is paperwork. Don't act like it matters. You've got no future without me anyway." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles hurt. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a deep, raw sense of betrayal that cut straight through me. For the first time, I realized that my parents weren't just neglectful or harsh. They were actively sabotaging me. They weren't trying to push me to be better. They were trying to keep me tethered to them, broken and dependent, so I'd never have the chance to prove them wrong. I think that was the moment I stopped seeing them as my parents in the way kids are supposed to. I started seeing them for who they really were, People willing to trade away their own son's future if it bought them another inch of control. And as much as I hated to admit it, that betrayal planted the seed of distance in me, a distance that, when they finally threw me out, made it easier to leave. Because somewhere deep down, I already knew they had never really wanted me to succeed. Of course, I didn't realize just how deep the rot went or how far they would drag Ryan into their world until years later, when their entire scheme unraveled in front of everyone. But that night, standing in my room with a crumpled credit notice in my hand, I knew one thing for certain. My family wasn't going to save me. They were the ones I needed saving from. And soon, their betrayal would grow into something so big, so undeniable, that even they wouldn't be able to hide it anymore. After the credit line fiasco, things between me and my parents were never the same. Not that they were ever great to begin with, but something shifted in me. I stopped arguing as much, stopped looking for scraps of approval. I still lived under their roof, but I felt more like a tenant in a hostile boarding house than a son. The air was always heavy with tension, and every word exchanged was just another opportunity for Dad to belittle me or Mom to guilt-trip me back into silence. The day it all came to a head is still crystal clear in my mind. I had just turned 19. I was in my room, headphones on, trying to drown out the noise of the television blaring downstairs when I heard my father's heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. He barged into my room without knocking, like always, and tossed a stack of papers onto my desk. "Sign these," he ordered. I looked down and saw forms with my name already filled in at the top. More financial documents. More obligations I hadn't asked for. My heart sank. "What is this?" I asked, my voice tight. "Business," he said flatly. "Nothing you need to understand. Just sign." I pushed the papers back toward him. "No, not again. I'm not doing this." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. His jaw tightened, and I could see the vein in his temple pulsing. Then he exploded. "You ungrateful little parasite. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" I laughed, though it wasn't from humor. It was that bitter kind of laugh that escapes when you're too angry to keep it in. "Everything you've done for me? You mean stealing my savings, ruining my credit, calling me a failure every chance you get? That was it." His face went red, his fists clenched, and he shouted, "Get out. You want to live your life your way? Fine, but not under my roof. Pack your things and get out of this house right now." I looked to the doorway, where my mom stood with her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like it was some television drama. For a split second, I thought maybe she'd say something, that maybe she'd finally step in. Instead, she just said coldly, "Your father's right. It's time you learned how the real world works." And just like that, I was out. I stuffed what little I owned into a backpack, some clothes, a toothbrush, the old MP3 player I'd saved up for, and walked out the front door. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody said goodbye. The air outside was biting cold, and I remember standing on the sidewalk, staring at my car, wondering what on earth I was supposed to do next. For the next few months, that car became my home. I parked in quiet neighborhoods or behind grocery stores, curling up in the back seat with a jacket pulled over me. Showers were rare, meals even rarer. I picked up odd jobs wherever I could, unloading trucks at dawn, washing dishes until midnight, anything that put a few bills in my pocket. There were nights I lay awake, stomach growling, staring at the condensation on the windows, and I'd hear my dad's voice in my head, "You'll never amount to anything." And some nights, I almost believed him. But the thing about hitting rock bottom is that it strips everything away, every excuse, every illusion. When you're cold, hungry, and alone, you stop wasting energy on what other people think. You start clinging to the smallest bits of progress because they're all you have. I'll never forget the first time I walked into a diner after getting paid for a week's work at the warehouse. I had enough for a real meal, eggs, toast, even a cup of coffee. It was nothing fancy, but as I sat there in that cracked vinyl booth, sipping coffee that tasted like burnt water, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. It was my money, earned honestly, and no one could take it away. That feeling became my lifeline. Every shift I worked, every paycheck I cashed, I reminded myself, this is mine, not theirs. Slowly, painfully, I started piecing together a life. I found a tiny room to rent, barely big enough for a mattress, but it was mine. I bought secondhand clothes that weren't hand-me-downs for Ryan. I started to imagine a future where I didn't have to carry the weight of my parents' contempt. But even as I worked toward building something for myself, the bitterness stayed. I'd walk past families in the street, parents smiling at their kids, kids laughing, and feel this ache in my chest. Why couldn't I have had that? Why did I have to claw for scraps while my brother was showered with praise? The anger became fuel, pushing me forward even on the nights when exhaustion threatened to drag me down. I told myself one thing over and over. I may be at rock bottom now, but I will climb out. And when I do, they'll see. They'll see exactly what the burden they threw away is capable of. What I didn't realize at the time was that while I was struggling to survive, my father was digging himself and Ryan into a pit far deeper than mine. A pit that would eventually drag the whole family into the spotlight and set the stage for the day I'd watch him shuffle into a courtroom in handcuffs. But before I got there, I had to learn how to rebuild from nothing and how to live with the scars of being discarded like I was never part of their family at all. The first real turning point came about a year after I'd been kicked out. I was still living paycheck to paycheck, but I had managed to trade the back seat of my car for a tiny studio apartment. It wasn't much, the kind of place where you could touch the kitchen counter from your bed, but to me, it was freedom. No one barged into my room without knocking. No one told me I was a burden. I'd come home, drop my keys on the chip table, and just stand there for a moment, soaking in the silence. That silence, which used to scare me, started to feel like peace. I kept grinding, working long shifts at the warehouse and taking odd jobs on weekends. But I also started paying attention. I had always been a decent learner, and I realized that the warehouse wasn't just about heavy lifting. It was about logistics, organization, efficiency. I asked questions, stayed late, and picked up on the small things others overlooked. After a while, my manager noticed. One day, he pulled me aside and said, "You've got a good head for this. Ever thought about moving up?" That moment lit a fire in me. Nobody in my family had ever told me I had a good head for anything. It was like someone had handed me a rope while I was climbing out of a well. I took every opportunity after that. Training programs, certifications, even night classes when I could afford them. It wasn't easy balancing it all, but for the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was building. By the time I was 24, I had moved into a better apartment, one with actual space to breathe. I had a reliable car, clothes that weren't from thrift stores, and a small circle of friends who treated me like I mattered. My career kept climbing, too. I worked my way into management, then into operations planning, and by 28, I was running a team. Every milestone felt like another brick laid in the wall, separating me from the life my parents had tried to trap me in. I'll admit, there was a part of me that wanted them to see it, to know that I had done it without them. Sometimes, I'd drive past the old neighborhood, slowing down as I neared the house I grew up in. The curtains in the front window were the same ones my mom used to fuss over. The paint on the porch railings was still peeling. I'd imagine walking up, knocking on the door, and seeing the look on my father's face when I told him how far I'd come. But I never did. I wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. Around this time, I started hearing whispers about my family. At first, it was little things, someone mentioning that my dad was always working deals, or that Ryan seemed to be his right-hand man now. The tone people used when they talked about them wasn't admiration, it was caution. Words like shady and sketchy floated around, and I couldn't help but wonder if the same schemes my dad once tried to rope me into were now swallowing my brother whole. The irony wasn't lost on me. My dad had spent years telling me I'd never amount to anything because I didn't follow him into his business. And yet here I was, climbing honestly, while Ryan was sinking deeper into Dad's world. I didn't feel smug exactly. It was more complicated than that. Ryan and I had never been close, but he was still my brother. Part of me wanted to believe he'd wake up and walk away before it was too late. Meanwhile, my own life kept expanding. At 29, I took the leap and started my own small logistics company. It was terrifying at first. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But all those years of grinding had taught me resilience. I poured everything I had into it, and slowly, it paid off. Clients started coming in, word of mouth spread, and I realized I had built something that was mine in every sense. The day I signed the papers on my first office lease, I sat alone in the empty space, the walls still bare, the air smelling faintly of paint. And I thought about that night when I was 19, standing on the sidewalk with a backpack in my hand and nowhere to go. I thought about the words my father had spat at me, "You'll never amount to anything." And I let myself smile, because I knew, deep down, I had already proved him wrong. But success has a way of drawing shadows from the past. The more I grew, the more I heard about the cracks forming in my father's empire. Rumors of investigations, associates suddenly disappearing from the picture, deals gone bad. I tried to stay out of it, but curiosity has a way of creeping in. And when I finally caught a glimpse of just how deep the trouble went, I realized the storm that had been brewing in the background was about to crash directly into my life. Because while I had been climbing, quietly, building a life on my own terms, my father had been digging himself and my brother into a pit so deep that even the strongest rope might not pull them out. And whether I liked it or not, they weren't about to suffer quietly. They were going to drag me back into their world, one desperate phone call at a time. The first call came on a gray Tuesday morning, just as I was heading into the office. I didn't recognize the number at first, but something about the long string of digits made my stomach flip. I answered hesitantly, and that's when I heard it, my father's voice, crackling through the line. "Ethan." I froze. It had been years since I'd spoken to him. My instinct was to hang up, but something in his tone stopped me. It wasn't the booming, authoritative voice I grew up with. It was thinner, strained, almost pleading. "I need your help," he said. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Memories of his words, his betrayals, his contempt, all of it rushed back at once. Finally, I managed a clipped, "How did you get this number?" He ignored the question. "I'm inside. They've got me in here like some kind of animal. You've got resources now, don't you? A company, money. You can bail me out. You have to." I hung up, but the calls kept coming. Each time, the same number, the same voice, the same desperation. Sometimes it was anger. "You owe me this." Sometimes it was guilt. "I'm your father. Family doesn't abandon family." And sometimes it was fear. "If I stay here, Ethan, I won't survive." At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was done with them, that their mess wasn't mine to clean up. But late at night, lying in bed, I'd think about all the years they had dragged me down, and part of me wondered if this was finally the shift in power I had been waiting for. For the first time, he needed me, not the other way around. Around that time, I was also learning more about his downfall through colleagues, through news articles, through whispers in town. Fraud, embezzlement, wire schemes so convoluted, even investigators had trouble untangling them. And Ryan, my golden child brother, wasn't just caught up in it. He was complicit. He had become my father's right hand, parroting the same arrogance, the same disdain, only now with his own fingerprints all over the evidence. The irony was sharp. The son they discarded had climbed honestly, while the son they worshipped was sinking in quicksand. But what struck me most wasn't their ruin. It was what I learned in the process. I met a man at a conference once, years back, who had worked as a federal investigator before shifting into private consulting. We'd stayed loosely connected, and when the news about my father broke, I reached out. Over coffee, I asked him questions, not just about the charges, but about the system itself, about how investigations worked, about how sentencing was determined, about what leverage prisoners thought they had. He didn't ask why I cared so much, and I didn't offer. But I left that meeting with something my father never expected me to have: knowledge. Knowledge of how the system worked, of what strings could be pulled, and what walls couldn't be scaled. I also learned something else. My father's case wasn't just a slap-on-the-wrist kind of fraud. He wasn't going to waltz out after a year or two. The evidence was stacked. The witnesses lined up. He had been sentenced to 5 years, and that was a mercy. From the way my contact put it, he was lucky it wasn't more. Knowing that gave me power, because every time my father called begging, demanding, threatening, I could hear the lie in his voice. He still thought he could manipulate me like I was 19 again, standing in the kitchen with my first paycheck in hand. He hadn't realized that the world had shifted, that I wasn't the boy he broke down. I was the man who had rebuilt himself from the ground up. The calls became almost entertaining. I didn't answer all of them, but sometimes I let him talk just to hear the cracks in his voice. Sometimes I'd say nothing, just listen until he trailed off in frustration. And every now and then, I'd drop a line that reminded him just how much had changed. "Funny, Dad. You always said I'd never have anything, and yet here you are asking me for help." What I didn't tell him, not yet, was that I was gathering every piece of information I could. Not because I wanted to bail him out, but because I wanted to understand the scope of his downfall, to know exactly what kind of empire he had traded me for and how hollow it really was. By then, my company was thriving. I had contracts with firms my father used to brag about working alongside. The difference? Mine were legitimate, clean. Every time I signed a new deal, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself they had tried to strip away. I had employees who respected me, clients who trusted me, and a reputation that was the polar opposite of his. And all the while, the phone kept ringing. His desperation was a reminder that the balance of power had finally shifted. He had shackles on his wrists and bars between him and the outside world, while I held the one thing he could never control: choice. What I didn't realize at the time was that his desperation would only grow sharper, uglier, that he would reach out in ways that threatened to pull me back into the chaos I had escaped. And when he did, I would have to decide just how far I was willing to go to make sure he and everyone else understood that I wasn't the burden anymore. When I finally decided to take action, it wasn't a snap decision. It was years of bitterness, years of their words echoing in my head, and months of those desperate phone calls that tipped the scales. I knew if I was going to do anything, it couldn't be impulsive. It had to be deliberate, smart, and above all, it had to leave no doubt in his mind that I was no longer the weak, desperate kid he tossed aside at 19. The opportunity came when he called one evening, his voice raw and frantic. "Ethan, listen to me. I can't stay in here. You don't understand these people." His voice broke into a cough. "You've got money now. You've got connections. Pull some strings. I'll make it worth your while." I let him rant until he ran out of breath. Then, calmly, I said, "Worth my while, Dad? You already made your choice years ago. You traded me for your schemes. Now you want me to clean up the mess you drowned yourself in." There was silence, and then the familiar sharpness returned. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. I built this family. Everything you have is because of me." That was the moment I knew exactly how I'd handle it. See, by then, my company had landed a major contract with a client I knew my father had once tried and failed to swindle. They respected me because I did things the right way, because I ran my business with integrity, the very thing he always mocked me for. I decided to lean into that. The next time he called, I told him, "Funny thing, Dad. I just signed a deal with Westbrook Logistics. Remember them? The ones you always bragged you were this close to locking down." I could hear the shift in his breathing. He remembered. "They're my clients now," I said, my voice steady. "They wanted someone reliable, someone who could deliver. So they came to me." For once, he didn't have a quick retort. The silence on the other end was heavier than any insult he'd ever thrown at me. But I didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I made sure word of my success filtered back to him. Mutual acquaintances, old family connections, I let them know how well I was doing, and I didn't hold back the details, the contracts, the growth, the respect I had earned. And every time, I knew it would make its way into that prison where he sat, powerless, listening to stories of the son he had called worthless becoming everything he swore I'd never be. The final stroke of my revenge was subtle but cutting. He called again, more desperate than ever, saying, "Ethan, you're my son. Family sticks together. Please, just help me get out of here." This time, I didn't hang up. I let him talk, let him plead. And when he finally ran out of words, I spoke softly. "Do you remember the night you threw me out? You said I was a burden who'd never amount to anything. You shut the door on me without a second thought." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "Now the door's shut on you, and I'm the one holding the key, but you'll never get it from me." He tried to interrupt, but I didn't let him. "You taught me a lot, Dad. You taught me what betrayal feels like. You taught me how it feels to be discarded. And now, you get to live with the consequences of your own choices. I don't owe you a thing." And then I hung up. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was the most powerful thing I'd ever done. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to his control, I was defining the terms. My revenge wasn't about shouting or slamming doors, or even vengeance in the dramatic sense. It was about living my life in a way that proved him wrong every single day and making sure he knew it. And from that point on, every time his calls came in, I let them ring. Because the silence of me not answering was the sweetest revenge of all. But the story doesn't end there. My father wasn't the kind of man to accept silence gracefully. And as his desperation grew, so did the lengths he was willing to go, dragging Ryan and my mother deeper into the chaos. That was when things took a darker turn, and I had to decide if cutting them off was enough, or if I needed to burn the bridge completely. The fallout came quicker than I expected. For months, I ignored his calls, each one more frantic than the last. At first, his messages were still wrapped in that old arrogance, demanding I help him because family is family. But as the weeks turned into months, the bravado cracked. His voice grew thinner, more desperate, until finally, he was just another man in a cage, begging for mercy. But my father wasn't the only one who paid the price. Ryan, my golden child brother, was pulled directly into the blast radius of Dad's schemes. The investigators didn't just stop with my father, They dug into his closest associates. And Ryan, who had strutted around for years, parroting Dad's arrogance, found himself facing charges of his own: fraud, conspiracy, aiding and abetting. He had been so busy playing the role of heir apparent that he never realized he was also a pawn. When the news broke, I sat in my office with the article pulled up on my laptop. The headline screamed about the family scandal, listing my father and brother by name. I read it twice, slowly letting every word sink in. For years, they had flaunted their power over me, and now, their names were plastered across the screen for the world to see, not as powerful men, but as criminals. My mother tried to reach out once after Ryan's sentencing. Her voice on the line was trembling, not with guilt, but with entitlement. "Ethan, you have to understand. Your father and brother made mistakes, but they're still family. You can't turn your back on us now." I almost laughed. "Now? You turned your back on me 15 years ago. The difference is, I built something out of the wreckage. You chose to stay in it." She tried to argue, tried to guilt-trip me the way she always had, but I didn't let her finish. I told her what I had told my father. "I don't owe you a thing." And then I ended the call. That was the last time I ever heard her voice. The years that followed were strange. On one hand, there was a part of me that mourned what could have been, a family that supported me, parents who believed in me, a brother who saw me as more than competition. But that part grew smaller with time, replaced by a deeper sense of clarity. I hadn't needed them to become who I was. In fact, I had become who I was because I had broken free. The final piece of closure came when my father was released. By then, his 5 years were up, and the man who walked out of those prison gates was not the towering figure of my childhood. He was smaller, thinner, his shoulders hunched. Word got back to me that he had tried to rebuild some kind of life, but nobody wanted to work with him. His name was mud, his reputation ruined. He had burned every bridge and discovered there was no one left to catch him. One evening, I was leaving my office when I saw him across the street. He spotted me, too, and for a long moment, we just stared. He started to step forward, his hand half raising as if to wave, but I didn't move. I just looked at him, really looked, and realized I felt nothing. No fear, no anger, not even triumph. Just nothing. I turned, unlocked my car, and drove away. That was my revenge. Not the silence, not the success, not even the satisfaction of watching him fall. It was knowing that he had spent his life trying to break me, and in the end, he had only broken himself. And as I pulled onto the highway, the weight of it all lifted, and one final thought settled in my mind like a closing chapter. I was never the burden. He was.